Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Able to Care podcast. My name is Andy Baker. I am the lead trainer and managing director of Able Training Support Limited, a company specialising in teaching and delivering training to the care sector. I've got over 20 years background in the health and social care industry, specialising in complex and challenging behaviour. And today my co-host is...
I'm Michael Ind. I have 30 years experience working in residential children's homes of various different kinds. And Andrew's just very kindly invited me along today to ask me some questions, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming along and joining us. Yeah, obviously our usual co-host Nadine, you look very different, so I don't think anybody will confuse the two of you. But yeah, Michael's very nicely stepped in to come and do a podcast with us. He's got a vast experience working with additional needs and children with additional needs specifically. And today's podcast, we're going to be talking about sensory processing disorder. So in the last podcast we did, episode 5, we looked at sensory processing in dementia. This time we're focusing more around kind of the child setting and learning disability, autism kind of area as far as sensory processing is concerned. So Michael and I have been having a little bit of a chat just before the podcast and things like that. And Michael's come across a few individuals in his time that have experienced, as he recognises now, I think you were sort of saying, some of the current children that you're supporting definitely have potentially got a diagnosis or something like that, and it's recognised. But you think over the time of your years, you've come across it, but it wasn't recognised.
And not recognised, possibly because the wealth of information that's now available, because of the training that's available to people, wasn't there when I started in 1991. Autism itself was not, certainly at the level that I was working at, was not understood as much as it is now. Definitely. I think is probably the case. And so those aspects of it were not understood at all, really.
Yeah.
It was a very different world back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I know you were saying there kind of when you first started teaching working in care, there was still this aspect of there was an aim to stop individuals with autism from behaving autistically. I think you were saying that about the stimming and stuff like that, as an example.
Yeah, that was something that would happen. So a young person would be flapping and they would be told to stop flapping, or there would be some other self-soothing behaviour the young person would be involved with. And I guess some of the concerns around that were, well, if someone's continually kind of flapping their hands, there's possible damage to joints and things like this. It came possibly from a good place, but actually maybe wasn't as helpful as it could have been.
Yeah, I know with a lot of the behavioural management stuff that I teach, so I'm trained in what's called applied behavioural analysis. And applied behavioural analysis was originally developed as a way of kind of getting children with autism not to be quite as autistic. Yeah. And it's got a lot of negative publicity. So one of the things we used to be kind of forcing them to engage in eye contact, because that's neurotypical behaviour and you should engage in eye contact. And when I'm teaching about it, I compare in a similar way to once upon a time we used to force left-handed people to write right-handed, and we thought that was the best thing and the right thing and they should do that. And I
was actually one of those people.
Oh, were you?
Yes, which caused, if anyone's ever seen my handwriting, they would realise that probably wasn't the right thing to do.
No, that's it. It's 100%.
I think there was a desire to try and cure people, wasn't there? And that's still prevalent in some settings. You still see some of that from time to time. Yeah. And actually, some of these things aren't curable. No. And it's helping people live with them, all people around them to live with them, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that as you said, there's a lot more understanding now. And if we look at, if we just take autism, and obviously there's loads of different conditions where sensory processing issues could play a part. But currently sensory processing isn't recognised as a separate diagnosis. It is only within the autistic diagnosis that sensory processing is kind of officially recognised. And it was 2013 that the Diagnostical Statistical Manual of Mental Health Illnesses, which is the American diagnostical tool, it was 2013 that autism, Asperger's, PDD and OS was changed to autism spectrum disorder, and that was included within it. But it was only January this year that the ICD-11, which is a European version of that, I don't know whether you're familiar with these at all, actually caught up and made the European in line with that. So Americans are always a bit ahead on the diagnostical tools. And that's where, again, sensory processing has been brought into that overall kind of diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about today will be more probably focused around children who are recognised to be in the autistic spectrum.
Yes.
About 90% is a statistic of children on the autistic spectrum have some level of sensory processing.
I had no idea it was that high. Yeah. That surprised me.
And there's actually more and more is starting to come to awareness that the sensory processing issues that those individuals are experiencing are probably more affect or impact more on their day-to-day life than actually the communication differences and difficulties are.
Yes.
That the communication difficulties and differences can be fairly easily overcome to some degree or another, but the sensory processing issues are something that also impact on communication.
Yeah.
We'll go through the kind of a little bit about the senses, and we'll kind of give a bit of information about them. And anytime you kind of jump in, and if you've got a story around it, we'll go, I met a kid like that, and we'll kind of do it that way, if that's all right, Michael.
That's fine.
Well, first off, the obvious question I think is worth getting people to think about is how many senses do we actually have? So I don't know whether you've done any training in this or you're aware of it, but how many senses are you aware of?
So the traditional answer to this, I feel like I'm on, is it QI where they have...
Yeah.
So the traditional answer to this is 5.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is sight,
Yep.
Touch,
Yeah.
smell,
Yeah. Taste.
Taste,
Yes, and
hearing.
There you go.
And that's but I'm aware that there's a sense of balance, for example.
Yeah.
There's a sense of kind of spatial awareness that's around. There's a sense of kind of compression and being held tight and that kind of thing, isn't there? So there are many more senses than just the 5 that we're originally 100%. Aware of, and other things will impact on those 5 as well. Yeah,
definitely. So there is a theory out there that actually there's 53. Yeah, so I mean, we're not going to go through all 53. We're not going to go and the sense number 49 is and stuff like that. And typically, when we're talking about sensory processing disorder and issues, we tend to base it on the 8. Okay, so we keep it fairly simple. So as you mentioned, the 5 you mentioned there are what we call the public senses. They're what we all experience. So as you say, it's kind of using our major organs, like our skin recognises tactile, our eyes for visual, ears for auditory, tongue for taste, nose for smell. So these are ones most people think of. You mentioned quite rightly some of the other ones there. So vestibular is the one you were mentioning around balance. Then we've got what we call proprioception, which I think is what you're referring to as like spatial awareness.
Yes, yeah.
So proprioception is knowing where our arms and legs are in the world, essentially knowing our kind of position, our body position. And the last one that we tend to refer to is called interoception. And interoception is our internal organs communicating with us. So hunger, thirst, tiredness, but also the emotions as well. So anger, fear, and stuff like that is how do you know when you're angry? Well, you can feel it. You tense up, your body temperature increases, your heart rate starts going. So these are also part of our senses. But and the reason it may seem like from 8 jumping to 53 seems quite a challenge. But for instance, if we take tactile, just as a simple one, well, I've got the ability to pick up gentle touch. I've got the ability for deep pressure, which you also mentioned there, for hot, for cold. One interesting one, and I actually heard this on QI, as you mentioned it, we don't actually have a tactile receptor for water, for wetness. We have no hydroreceptors, so we can't feel wet. So the only way that we know something is wet is due to temperature and tactile reduction, so we can't feel wet. Again, I found that interesting, but it's
the kind of fact that appeals to me too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, interesting. So there's only a few animals that can, like we can't taste water, but dogs can, for instance, as well, which is quite interesting. So, or interesting-ish. As far as those 8 senses then, I know when we were chatting, there's a bit of a stereotype around autism, isn't there? That most people are aware that some kids with autism have ear defenders.
Yeah, I think there's been, certainly on television programmes and films, that's been the portrayal of it. And indeed, there are some children I've worked with who have, and it has been helpful to have those, especially as I mentioned, as we were talking earlier, if you have a residential establishment which has fire checks once a week, as they're meant to, and you have young people who are very find the alarms very difficult, and so the ear defenders at those times can be very helpful. And just sometimes just kind of blocking out general noise, because a residential establishment can be a very, very noisy place, and
busy,
lots of stimulus in there anyway.
100%. I think you said the place you currently work is 10 children on the premises, isn't it? And any place with, I mean, that's 10 children plus staff.
Yes.
And I should imagine you've got a fair few staff in. I should imagine it's quite a busy environment. It's not going to have quiet very often, is it? I think one thing to just address on that, I think straight away, that I think there's a confusion sometimes that I've come across though, that, he struggles with noise, in the fact that there's an external, like a fire alarm or something like that. But then that same kid will then go up to their bedroom and they'll put the TV on and the radio on and the music on and stuff like that, and full volume. And it's like, well, how are they experiencing difficulty with noise if they can do that? And one of the things, and I mentioned it to you, is, well, one you can control and one you can't.
Yeah.
And there's a big difference between something you control and something you can't. If it becomes overwhelming and I control it, I can turn them off.
Yeah.
If somebody else is making that noise and I can't control it, then that's going to become overwhelming. I don't know how to escape this. And I think that's always worth kind of bearing in mind because there is numerous ways that these different discrimination of the information that they get comes through. Yeah. So there is what's called sensory processing disorder. So a Dr. Ayres, an occupational therapist, basically kind of recognised that some children seem to be, she referred to kind of out of sync with their sensory processing and what's called sensory integration. So we've got these 8 different senses that all come through, and integration is the blend of those senses together to help us to understand the world. And I think you've already kind of mentioned that or referred to that. And I used in the example in the last podcast that when I look at a cup, I'm using my eyes, but actually there's loads of pre-information I've gained through my senses. I know what texture that's going to feel like. I know what weight it's going to be. And I kind of know whether it's going to feel cold on my skin or warm on my skin and those sorts of things. If it's got stuff in it, it'll feel warm. And I only know that through previous experience and previous learning, and an integration of those different senses together. I must have touched a cup before. I must have felt it. I must have put it to my mouth and stuff like that to know that information. If I've never experienced that before, I wouldn't have ever kind of developed it. So sensory processing disorder is usually about a difficulty with the integration of those different senses together. And you'll see from the bit of paper there, this kind of hierarchy. So from sensory processing disorder, we've then got 3 different disorders that affect it. So, or could be part of that. We've got sensory modulation disorder. So just to expand on what modulation is a little bit, there's a couple of examples or analogies you could use. But one is, I think I mentioned in the last podcast, like a mixing desk in our brain that's kind of all the information is coming through and we adjust the levels to be able to cope with that information and make sure they balance out. Another quite a good example is like when we're cooking, that we can turn up the hob, we can turn down the hob of all the different dishes that we're cooking to make sure the meal all comes together at the same time. If we heat up too much, it boils too quick. If we turn it down too low, it takes ages to boil. So if we think of that as modulation about sensory information coming through, if it is sound, and we'll use that one because, again, like I said, most people have some experience of that. If I'm poor at modulating sound input and people are making noise in the background, I can probably shut that noise off a little bit and just go, don't pay attention to it, and kind of habituate to that noise. Whereas somebody with sensory processing issues may really struggle to do that. They can't adjust the volume, if you like, on the mixing desk. So it's too loud and they can't turn it down or ignore it. So one way I kind of get this over is, have you ever heard of what's called the cocktail party phenomenon?
Don't think so.
No, okay. So the cocktail party phenomenon is if we're at a bar and me and you are having a conversation, there's obviously loads of other conversations going on around the room. Yeah. But I'm able to kind of drown all of those out and just focus on our conversation. Yes. Now, I'm still listening or I'm still hearing all of the other conversations. I'm just not listening to them. Yeah. Because if I hear my name mentioned, that will draw my attention to it. I see. So I'm able to kind of modulate what I want to pay attention to and what I don't want to pay attention to. So I use an example like if I'm watching the TV and I hear a plane go over, I might go, oh, plane. But then I switch the plane off and I just focus on the TV essentially. And I'm able to kind of desensitize to all the other information. But somebody with modulation difficulties may have to listen to the TV and the plane and the clock ticking and the tap dripping and the neighbour 3 door just banged a door, but it sounded like it was in the room, and I'm feeling the clothes on my skin and all of those kind of inputs are coming through at the same time. Now, for those of you at home think that sounds quite rough, most of us experience this to a certain extent. Have you ever had it, Michael, where you're, let's say, trying to get on with some work, probably at work, trying to do your handover notes or something like that, and other people have been making noise in the background, you can feel this anxiety building, going, can you be quiet? I'm trying to concentrate. Yeah. And it's that sensation of not being able to modulate the information coming through that starts to build anxiety.
Yeah.
And I use the analogy of that. Imagine that times 1,000 every second of every day.
It would be incredibly difficult to work with. And I think I've seen children have struggled with that to process everything, and the level of confusion it causes, which again causes great anxiety, doesn't it?
Massively.
You've got that kind of, and it is a sense of confusion, isn't it, that it causes, definitely.
And I think, and this is where it ties in with that autism side of things. That let's say that we've got a child who's trying to process all of the auditory information that's coming on in the environment. As I say, even when we're in a quiet room right now, the lights are making a noise. There is the rustle of the paper, there is the breathing in the room and stuff, but we're not paying attention to it. But imagine I'm having to process that, and then somebody asks me a question. I've then got to kind of discriminate and make sure I'm aware that question is more important than all the other sounds in the room.
Yeah.
Now that, for me, my brain does it like that most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. But for somebody with sensory processing, it might have to be a case of, okay, that's not important, 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 that's not important. Oh, somebody just spoke to me. I need to do something with that. But quite often, because that isn't instantaneous, we then to think they haven't listened to us, haven't heard us, so then we then to repeat it. So now we've just added more stimulation on top of again. So we're going to go through that same journey again. Now we're starting to get irritated with them because they're not listening to us. And suddenly this child is getting told off because they're not listening. And it's that not understanding their processing time. And I'm sure you've seen that.
Very much so. There's sort of the processing time. But I mean, we have children who can take 2 days to process things.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly there's a delay in processing with most of the young people I work with. There's a good 2 or 3 minutes between asking something, and for some children, repeating the question is an acceptable way of doing
beneficial.
it. For other young people, it's a case of leave it and allow them to process that information and then react to it.
So obviously you've probably been working with a lot of the children that you've got in your care at the moment. You said, I think you've been 8 years at the place.
8 years,
currently at.
Years,
and obviously I'm sure you've seen some children come and some children go and stuff like that. But I should imagine you learn about the particular children and you get used to that and give them a couple of minutes. How do you find new staff kind of engage with that or cope with that?
It's quite difficult for new staff coming in to learn. I mean, we have very detailed care planning process, so the information is very clearly written down.
Yeah.
This is what needs to be done with this particular child. This is how we work alongside this child to help them achieve the best they can achieve. But there's a difference between reading something on paper and actually experiencing it, and then the emotions that can be conveyed when that feeling of not being listened to, for example, for an adult can actually be very challenging, can't it?
Absolutely.
Until you understand it's not a personal thing, then actually it makes you angry, it makes you feel, oh, no one's listening to me. I don't feel happy about that. I'm not being valued. And so there's a response to that. So it's very necessary to kind of train that out of people. So actually, it's not a personal thing. This young person needs time to process, and you will build that relationship more effectively if you give that young person time to process properly. Yeah,
I think personalization, there's no point in criticizing stuff for that. I think it's perfectly normal. I always use the example that if I'm teaching, and when I first started teaching and I saw somebody yawn, I immediately assumed that I was boring. Where there's lots of reasons why they might be yawning, and that's the same, isn't it? They're not listening to me and personalizing it. I remember reading a wonderful story there's a book called The Reason I Jump. It's written by a non-verbal autistic lad. He learned how to write using an iPad, and he's now written, I think, 3 books he's actually put together. And it's really nicely written, kind of short stories, nice and easy to read. I recommend to anybody who's interested in working with those on the autistic spectrum to read it. And I remember one particular chapter kind of stood out to me, and it was kind of a bit of a, I get it, kind of moment. I think I'm going to paraphrase here, but he said, I knew my mum was in the room and I knew she was talking to me, but I was watching the dust dance in the sunlight, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. So she just didn't seem important in that moment. And to me, that was just like, oh, yeah, I get that. Because if I was looking at Niagara Falls and somebody said to me, have you got your socks on yet? I'd probably go, you're not important.
I suppose it's
I think the autistic aspect is the whether mum's important in that moment, but the sensory processing is the watching the dust to dance in the sunlight. And when we talk about the modulation side of things, like I said, that it could be overwhelming, but there's one of the things, it could be that sensory seeking. They're understimulated by stuff in the environment as well.
So I've also encountered that in my workplace. I have a young person who I work with who will deliberately wet floors.
Right.
And it was odd you saying about the water actually earlier, that we don't have a sense of wet. So perhaps it is not that he's feeling water, that actually he's wanting the temperature or something like that. But he likes to have the floor slippery and wet so that he can feel it on his feet. And if he can't, if a tap isn't available to do that with, then he will dribble.
Right.
Or he might urinate on the floor as well. Yeah. So that's in order to create that sensation, which is quite distressing for people working with it who don't understand it.
100%.
So it's very important to make sure that there are opportunities for play in the bathroom. We have wet rooms at work, so it's good for him to use those wet rooms for that kind of sensory exploration that he clearly requires. It settles him, it calms him. It's something he very obviously needs to do.
There's one similar to that. He would pee. So this is a lad that had in my care, and he used to pee on clothing.
Yes.
And he also used to prefer to go in the cat litter tray than in the toilet.
Okay.
And when we explored that, it seemed to be a visual thing. He enjoyed the colour change.
Oh, okay.
But it was a kind of so again, it's
sensory,
that one kind of activity of peeing on stuff that you can, lots of different reasons. And the assumption would probably be dirty protest, like doing it on purpose to wind me up. But it's very much a case of, it was some sensory input that he was getting from that activity. It could have been a little bit of auditory as well, but we think it was more visual. Yeah, we believe that was the case. So I said on that first kind of list, the sensory modulation disorder, there's three categories that then fall under that. We've kind of adhered to a couple of them. So sensory under responsivity. So most of us kind of stay within a kind of field of coping. We've all go through periods of, one thing I'd say, Michael, I don't know whether you for yourself, I know there's times where I have slight sensory difficulties. For me personally, when I get very tired, I struggle with soft touch. Like I'm much more hypersensitive. I don't know whether you've got any in yours, but
I suppose actually, I suppose if I'm tired, I'm more sensitive to pain. I don't know whether that falls.
Yeah, I think it would
there are
do.
things like if I'm walking home, if I'm tired, I can feel the soles of my feet hurting. Whereas if I'm had a good night's sleep and I'm not tired, then I don't even notice. So
I spoke to Nadine, who usually does a podcast with me. She struggles with noise. So when she starts to get tired, she finds that noises and too many people in the room start to become overwhelming for her and stuff. So one thing is always worthwhile, isn't it? That everything's a spectrum, and we all have sensory biases. Like I'll probably like taste a certain food and you'll like different tasting food, and some people like it dim in a room and some people like it light in a room and some people like it cold and some people like it hot, and they're just sensory biases, what we all like. We all have sensory difficulties where we find things a bit overwhelming, like as you said, when you're tired, you struggle with pain a little bit more.
Going back to QI, I actually saw an interesting thing about the taste of coriander.
Right, okay.
And some people taste coriander and find it very nice genetically.
Right.
Whereas some people taste a very soapy taste and don't like it at all. And they think it's a genetic thing. The famous internet thing, wasn't it? That what colour is the dress? And some people saw blue and some people saw white or grey. That kind of thing as well.
Yeah, so that's just differences in our brains.
That's the spectrum, isn't it? That's the spectrum.
It is,
But to be that off the spectrum,
that's
or
it,
that far along the spectrum.
And that's where it's a disorder. Like we always use that term disorder. It impacts on their ability to engage in day-to-day life that makes it a disorder. So we all have difficulties. We can all dysfunction, but disorder is where it's impacting. So the under-responsivity is a lack of stimulus. Everything feels a little bit underwhelming, if you like. The over-sensory or over-responsivity is where everything feels too much. The volume is turned up on every one of the senses too much. And that's the easiest way I can maybe separate. There's also what's called sensory craving. And sensory craving is where individuals who seek out this sensory information. So they constantly want to touch everything. They want to keep moving all the time. They seek out visual stimulus or auditory stimulus and stuff like that. And I think when we were talking about the the child who they seek out the sensory as far as lots of things in their environment, but then they're running away from too much noise that they can't control. I think nobody likes to fit into one box, and this is always a bit of you can have some individuals who are sensory under responsive in some of their senses and over responsive in other senses, and that can actually fluctuate as well. There's what we call sensory fluctuators, which actually can change throughout the day and go between the two.
Depending on, I guess, how tired or how awake they are, or varying factors.
Yeah, absolutely.
I did actually work with one young man, and he was under responsive to. Yeah. He would spend his whole day in bed, just with his duvet pulled over. And initially, we thought that this was because he was tired, or there were various issues around him being tired, not wanting to get up, task avoidance, this kind of thing. But it was what we learned, or what we were told when they examined it, was that actually he was sensitive. What he needed was more stimulus to get him up, and to get him out of bed. And so we did stuff like add music and add smells from the kitchen, bacon cooking, that kind of thing, to try and get him to get up, to raise the sensory environment for that young person. Yeah. And it worked with varying degrees of success, but it was
brilliant. That's kind of nice you referred to that. One of the things, there's a book by a lady called Carol Kranowitz called The Out of Sync Child, and she summarised each of these different labels, if you like, probably the easiest way of referring to them, in ways that may be a little bit more accessible for the non-scientific community kind of thing. And she referred to, the over-responsive, where the volume's turned up too much, she referred to as sensory avoiders, because everything's too much, so these kids want to move away from it. They want to escape it, whether it be headphones or whether it be just having a meltdown because they need to leave the room or whatever it is. The person you were just mentioning there, was it a lad that you mentioned?
Yes.
Yeah. So potentially he's under responsive, so he's understimulated, as you mentioned there. And she referred to it and described it like the sensory straggler and the sensory slumper as well. And it's kind of that sensory straggler is a little bit kind of what's going on, and they're kind of slow on the uptake of sensory information, not anything else. But so it takes them a while to process that information. It takes them a while to catch up with what's going on, and because it's understimulating, they don't seek it out. They're kind of there's a nice analogy, which is imagine that the size of my cup is different. So if you've got somebody with a kind of a large cup, they need more sensory information to get that same kind of response or same stimulus. But then there's two personality types. There's the one that kind of isn't bothered where it's full, so they become the sensory slumper, they don't engage, or you've got the ones that want it, so they become the sensory seeker. They try and find that more information. So the sensory seeker is sensory craving. Is that difference in really whether they're active in seeking that information, or they just can't be bothered with it.
And
they're
so
just understimulated.
So can the person be both those things
at various times?
As you said, as we were saying earlier.
And it's a little bit personality type in there. It's kind of what kind of personality they've got. Are they somebody who wants to feel stimulated, or they're just given up on feeling stimulated? And I think that makes quite a difference.
I suspect this young person was both from his behaviours. There were things that he would love the music up loud, and then at other times it was complete dark and quiet.
Right, okay. So did he struggle with his sleeping and stuff like that?
Massively,
any little light in the room, any little noise in the room and stuff like that. That's it. So sensory processing doesn't turn off when it's time for bedtime.
I think the whole circadian rhythm thing was out. There was no circadian rhythm at all there. I
think we could probably do a whole other podcast on just on sleeping and autism and special educational needs, because whether it be ADHD or whatever it is, I think sleeping is one of those times a lot of people have challenges. And I think
indeed,
our westernized ideas of when we should be sleeping, that you go to bed at this time, you get up at this time, are not suitable for all of us, but we beat ourselves up when that isn't the case. And we all know an early bird and a night owl kind of thing. And so just to continue on as far as the labels then. So there's three different ones with a sensory modulation disorder: under responsivity, over responsivity, and then this sensory craving. Now there is a different thing called sensory discrimination. I don't know whether you aware of that at all.
No.
So discrimination is the fact that I can feel two different materials and tell the difference between them. The fact that you can say sealed or shield, and I can tell the difference between those two words. These are ability to discriminate between colours, sounds, textures. It again, all of the senses. Now, discrimination basically lets us know what's safe and what's not safe. So when we're very young, we're high in defensiveness and low in discrimination. So if you imagine like a doorbell, for instance, well, the first time I hear a doorbell, like all dogs do, they bark at the doorbell because they don't generate that discrimination to go, that's actually a dangerous sound. It's basically loud noise. That could mean something. I need to bark. And that's similar to kids in early stages. So new touches, new sensations can feel, they've got to be defensive towards them because they might be dangerous. As we get older, as we develop, we increase towards discrimination. So when I hear the doorbell and go to it and I see this person and it's my grandmother and I know it's okay for her to give me a hug and stuff like that, because all of those things are safe. So over a period of time, through experiences, we start to develop the ability to discriminate rather than be defensive. Hopefully I explained that fairly well.
That makes sense.
And one of the recognitions with individuals with sensory discrimination order is they don't do that. They don't develop that learning and that ability. So they can't differentiate between the different senses in the same way. So whether it be auditory, they can't tell the difference between shield and sealed. So that's going to cause confusion in communication, for instance. They can't differentiate in movement and colours in the same way as we might consider to be appropriate. So in all of the 8 senses, you might have an individual who struggles to discriminate between like, where am I being touched on my body? As an example, they may struggle to discriminate. Is that a soft touch or is it a hard touch? I may struggle to discriminate between the two. So this causes a whole new set of challenges that mixed in with the modulation. So the analogy for discrimination I use, and it ties in the two, I think most of us we manage our senses a bit like a traffic conductor, a policeman managing the traffic, kind of going, okay, we're paying attention to you right now. You come this way on this route. All the rest of you stay on red. All the rest of you stay where you are as far as the cars are concerned.
Presumably there's some kind of safety thing in the hierarchy we give to those. So there's a discrimination about this is the most important thing at the moment.
Yes.
Have you ever seen the thing where you have the book and the things that, if you read a book and the words that appear a threat to you, so for example, if you see the word wolf written on a page, that will be the first word you see on the page because there's a link between that and danger. So those things are the first. So I'm imagining that's that hierarchy of what's threatening is what comes up as an evolutionary thing.
I haven't come across it on the reading thing. That's really interesting. Obviously, that makes sense with an auditory. We definitely kind of and we notice things that are more important.
The sense of smell, for example, our sense of smell is probably our most finely tuned. And why you very quickly lose the smell of your own aftershave is because you're trained to receive new smells that may be threatening.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So the loss of smell of the aftershave, for instance, that's called kind of sensory adaptation. Yeah. Because if we were smelling that all of the time, that would be overwhelming, and
you wouldn't be able to smell things that might be a threat to you.
Absolutely. And same as like the clothing on your skin. Yeah. You're not aware of it. You switch it off because then you wouldn't be able to tell if somebody was touching you, for instance. There's also, and part of that, and I think it's what you're referring to slightly, is what's called habituation. So habituation is where a bit like with drugs, where you habituate to a drug over a period of time, and that's why you need more of the same drug to get the same effect. If I'm at a firework display and I hear a loud bang, the first bang, I'll probably jump. But then I probably don't jump for the second, third, fourth, fifth bang, because my brain then goes, that happened, it wasn't dangerous, you don't need to react emotionally to it anymore. So you develop this habituation. That's a short-term kind of coping strategy. So it's a bit of a mix. And again, like you were saying, this is one of the problems for people with sensory processing. They don't seem to habituate in the same way. Yeah. So that first bang is as bad as the second bang, third bang, fourth bang, fifth bang. The brain doesn't kind of learn to go, that's not actually dangerous, so don't need to react to that. So within the discrimination side of things, this habituation of switching it off that they don't seem to do. So the traffic conductor kind of thing, they've got all of it coming and it's causing a big traffic jam. And discrimination is going, they're parked cars, I don't need to pay attention to those. And as you said, that's a danger. I need to let that ambulance come through as following that analogy forwards, basically. And that's where the discrimination comes in. So the modulation is managing the traffic. The discrimination is telling what I should and shouldn't be paying attention to. It's probably a simple way of putting an analogy on those. So with the with Carol Kranowitz, she described that as like a sensory jumbler, that they get things mixed up and they make mistakes a lot and stuff like that related to the information coming through. So, kind of what does this mean? They don't get the information. Is that good or is it bad? Is it not? So I thought that was quite a nice way of the sensory jumbler kind of describing it. The last part of that hierarchy that you can see, sensory-based motor disorders. So sensory-based motor disorder is always going to be a bit of a combination of numerous senses. So you've got obviously our tactile, our proprioception, as we mentioned, but also even our visuals coming into that. So within that, you'll see dyspraxia. Yes. So dyspraxia isn't usually thought of particularly as a sensory processing disorder, but dyspraxia is the inability to either visualize something in your mind's eye, so picturing and planning your movement. So to put it into let me see if we can put it into a context. So if I put lots of different objects out in front of you, got you to close your eyes and then said, right, when you open your eyes, I'd like you to pick up the blue ball. Yeah. There'd be a pause, not just as you found the blue ball, but also while your brain's programming and I need to move my hand over to pick up that object and bring it back and show it. So there's actually quite a lot of planning that's involved. I mean, this obviously happens like that.
It's a sequential thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's completely automatic and stuff. Yeah. With dyspraxia, that would be significantly slower. They might struggle to do it. It'd take them a lot longer, and they might knock over a few other things to get to it because it isn't as automatic, basically. Yeah. The other one with that is if I was to give you a toilet roll tube and I was to go, okay, I'd like you to make something out of that, turn it into something else. What else could that be? Yeah. And you could give it to most children and immediately, it could be a telescope or something like that. There's actually quite a lot there. One, that's visualizing in the mind's eye what else I could use it for. But then it's actually the motor skills of bringing it up to my eye. It's actually orientating it. Which way round does it go? Because if I'm staring into the side of the toilet roll tube, it doesn't have the telescopic effect that we want. So actually, there's quite a few parts to that, and that's where dyspraxia comes in. It's that integration difficulty with all of those different senses coming in. So, and I know there's a lot of comorbidity with probably a lot of the children.
Autism, it's that kind of it's clumsiness, and it's actually it's the dyspraxia.
Yeah, or sensory processing issues, absolutely. And the last one there is postural disorders, sometimes referred to as sensory slumpers, and they're maybe more like the lad that you mentioned as well, that it was those particular senses, so he didn't want to get out of bed, perceived as lazy, non-engaged, because even something as simple as lifting your arm up in the air requires so much sensory processing work with proprioception, tactile, fighting against gravity, vestibular and stuff like that we take for granted. So if I'm either under or overstimulated by that, it suddenly becomes hard. Yeah. So I think it's worth, again, for people who are working with anybody with special educational needs or autism or anything along those lines, I think it's definitely worth finding more out about or working sensory processing issues into their detective work, kind of like, well, is it behavior or is it sensory? Or
very, very much so. And as going back to when we started the conversation about how things have moved on, and I look back at some of the children who I've worked with, and if only we'd known more than we knew now, then some of the outcomes of those young people could have been very different. Yeah. And so they would have gone for a lot less kind of stress and trauma themselves, had people been aware that actually they are struggling with this, and it's not fair to blame them for something which is part of the disability.
Yeah, definitely. I think we were chatting as well about ADHD as an example, and I think we could kind of put three things together of anxiety, ADHD, and then sensory processing. Yeah. When I'm anxious, I struggle to sit still. I struggle to focus on things, and obviously it affects emotionally and stuff like that. But so that might be you might recognise I'm feeling anxious because I'm fidgeting, I'm not sitting still, and I don't seem to be concentrating. Somebody with ADHD may struggle to sit still. They may struggle to focus and pay attention to things, and may be very impulsive in their actions and stuff like that. But what if we've got a child who's actually sensory craving, or sensory or under responsive, so they struggle with their balance. And one of the things that, when I was looking into this, one of the things that I found really fascinating, I would consider sitting or standing still to require less balance than walking. But actually it's completely the opposite way around. Yeah. And as soon as it was pointing out, kind of, well, think about riding a bike. I'm like, yeah, it's a lot easier when you're moving, when you're not.
Yeah. Well, there's actually footage of people with Parkinson's disease riding bikes.
Yeah.
Who can barely stand up.
Absolutely.
And they're riding a bike absolutely purposely.
Yeah. And it's something I'd never really thought about before. That and so I had a child in my household that he struggled to sit. He was constantly up and down and up and down. And it was definitely he loved the trampoline as well, which was a really big way of helping him to get back into his own body, if you like, and re-sync with his proprioception or with his vestibular system. And meal times were always a bit of a challenge until we got like a rickety old piano stool, and when he was eating he'd get very overexcited and he'd kind of pick things up and then he'd stand up and then he'd stim for a little bit and then he'd sit back down and then he'd get up and then stim for a little bit, and then we got this rickety old piano stool. Everything changed and he was just sat there for the whole thing kind of rocking and wiggling in this with a smile on his face, kind of eating away. And it just, by giving him that sensory input in one way, that saved him having to get it independently and do it in other ways. So obviously we mentioned the ear defenders. What other stuff do you have in your environment at the moment, or that you've used in the past?
So at times I've worked and we've limited the surroundings, so not too much stuff up on the walls. And it's very tempting in an establishment to have lots of pictures and lots of things up on the walls all the time. And for some children, it's good because you can use pictogram things to illustrate, but for some children, that's not the right way forward. They're overstimulated by them. It doesn't. That's one thing. We have sound sensory rooms, which are quiet, white walls, so it's less stimulation from that, where we can take children. And then if they want to play loud music there, that's something they can do. I think of some of the visual things. As a young lad, it's funny you should say we have a trampoline for that. Not purely for that, but because some children do like that. They're kind of bouncing swings as well, for that kind of sensory stimulation. And then general kind of sensory work that you might do with young people, toys, sand, what's the sand? Kinetic sand is quite good. So play, touch things for the children who are understimulated. Messy play for those as well. So lots of things like that, really. I think if there's anything for children who are overstimulated by things, just the ear defenders are the main
ear
one.
defenders, and you said about the sensory, where it's quiet room basically. So you've got quiet spaces, safe spaces, and stuff like that.
I guess things like at night time when you want them, because sometimes you want the environment to be up and sometimes you want it to be a bit down. So things like managing the lighting in the place. We've got a very good lighting system at the moment where we can kind of modulate in each of the children's bedrooms. We can modulate, but also on the corridors. We can modulate it night and daytime settings to kind of, this is calming down time. This
that's it.
Building up time.
If they're overly visually stimulated, then just a red light on the TV, standby light, could be too much for them, and suddenly that's stopping them from sleeping, 100%. So some of the things you're referring to there, and I don't know whether you've ever come across it. So there's a thing called a sensory diet. Have you ever heard that terminology?
I have heard that terminology, yes.
So with occupational therapy with sensory integration, which is perceived, or a lot of people feel is the best thing to help children to overcome and manage. So it's basically, as we said about habituation, it's not that they can't, they may just need an awful lot more help to habituate to certain senses. So a sensory diet kind of works to their strengths. It helps them to feel in their own body, because especially the ones like proprioception, tactile and vestibular, when they're disorganized, if they're out of sync, and we'll just use that term of Carol Kranowitz, when they're out of sync, you feel disconnected from yourself. In the end, knowing where I am in the world, knowing where I end and other things start and things like that helps me to feel safe within my own body, comfortable in your own skin. We've all heard that terminology before.
And I think when you work with autistic children, one of the things you see is that sense of they are disconnected from the world they're in. There's a sense of disconnection. And being, I always imagine it as being everybody's perception of the world is slightly different. But when we go back to the extremes again, they're on the extremes, and their perception of the world must be so massively different from mine, perhaps.
Yeah.
It must be incredibly difficult to understand having that difference going on.
Yeah, definitely. And it's no wonder that anxiety is so connected, isn't it? Because when the world is chaotic, when my vestibular system isn't working, straight away I'm not going to feel connected, which is going to make me feel anxious, which is then going to lead to further exasperation and stuff. So, with the sensory diet, the aim is kind of every 90 minutes to 2 hours, the child or the individual is encouraged to engage in kind of sensory activities. And it's used kind of either preventatively or during. So like with the example there with the stool, that's something during the activity to help them to re-regulate. But another thing we used to do is get this lad to go on the trampoline before we sat down for meals, because meals at the time he found hard. So therefore, let's re-regulate him. Let's get him feeling comfortable in his own skin. Get our vestibular system kind of organised a little bit. So heavy work is one thing that, like the deep pressure, similar to deep pressure, basically carrying something heavy helps them to feel more connected with their own body and the world again. So using these every 90 minutes.
That's interesting. I worked with another young person who he ended up, he would we would have the heavy rucksack on, and he would keep that on, and that made him feel contained and secure. I mean, we'll be doing also weighted blankets, of course, are quite common and have become almost a stereotype in autistic places, haven't they?
They have,
weighted blanket, but they're useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you another one, which is so with a lot of individuals with sensory processing struggle with oral motor skills, so eating. And sometimes, do they not like that food because it's the texture? Is it the way it looks? So this could be visual, it could be tactile, it could be taste, it could be smell. There's lots of reasons why they might not want that meal. If it's tactile, because sometimes it's about texture, one way you can desensitize that tactile is using an electric toothbrush. So you regularly get them to use the electric toothbrush, not just at meal times, more often throughout the day, to basically habituate and desensitize their mouth a little bit, so that they then can cope with more textures and more taste and not feel quite so overwhelmed.
Well, I did some training with CAMS a while back, quite a few years ago now. One of the things they were looking at is eating disorders, as you mentioned, and the thing that actually a child needs to see something on their plate at least 10 times before they eat it, but also how important it was for children to be allowed to play with their food, because actually the first step towards the tasting is actually playing with your fingers, and the sensation on your finger is the tactile thing, so that when it goes in your mouth, it's not quite so much of a shock to you.
I think just to kind of summarise and to bring it to a close, look at, and we've touched on a few bits of what we can do to help. Just bringing in the example of going to the hairdressers and looking at something as simple as that we take for granted. I know you were just kind of chatting there before about, you found the hairdressers quite a difficult experience, because it is sitting still sitting still for a long time. So you've got that kind of the vestibular, the proprioception system, but it's the sounds, it's the smells, it's the noises, everything within an environment. So a few things we can do kind of preventative. A big thing is planning, isn't it? And I know that's a lot of your care plans that you'll work with is we try and, I use the analogy, and I spoke to you earlier about it, of kind of the firefighting, that sometimes no matter what you do, you still need a fire extinguisher, but you should put far more time and effort into preventative or how to prevent a fire. So having a sensory room within your home is a preventative aspect of, you may not need it for every kid, but it's there, waiting, willing for anybody who does need it. Quiet areas, minimizing stimulus off the walls, these are all kind of preventative things.
Yes.
But planning is if I was, let's say, taking a child to the theme park, for instance.
Yes.
There's so much risk assessment and planning that would go into that. It isn't just to kind of wake up one day and go, hey, let's go to the theme park, because some of the kids you work with, that would not work, and it would just be a disaster.
Absolutely.
And you're planning all the way from what are they not able to eat? Can we take that food with them? Is there somewhere to eat? What rides would they do? Will this kid do any rides? Because if it's vestibular oversensitive, then they ain't going to like rides. If they're understimulated, they'll love the rides.
Yeah.
So
how will you get them off the rides?
Yeah, absolutely. But even like waiting and queuing and is it busy? And that's, we talk about social stories as well of like preparing them for, it's going to be busy. There's going to be a lot of children around helping them.
Might be a photograph as well. Photographs and things like that are good.
Well, that's the what I refer to as priming. I don't know whether you've got a different word for that. So that's the let's watch a video of the ride and and all it is trying to get them ready that predictability is something that's very much the requirement of those on the autistic spectrum. We all like predictability to a certain extent. Very few of us enjoy the day when our service engineer will be with you between 9 and 5. That's never a good day. We like to know what's happening and when it's happening, but that's something that's a kind of ingrained need into those on the autistic spectrum. And for those who find the world disorganized and overwhelming with the sensory. So priming is getting them. So within hairdressers, for instance, we did it where we actually borrowed the hairdresser's apron. So we could then do some work to get them used to the smell, get them used to the sensation of the apron on them and things like that to help them to get ready, to prime them before they turn up. We actually, Michael and I both know each other from the martial arts studio in town. I had somebody contact me about their kid who was autistic attending a martial art class. And it was that kind of bit where she asked about, he'd like to come to martial arts and asked a load of questions. And right at the end, it was kind of like, maybe I can get away with this. By the way, he's autistic. Is he still okay if he comes? And it's such a sad thing that she felt like that. But absolutely. So the best thing is, like, here's what we'll do. Just get him along to come along 5 minutes. Don't worry about a lesson. How does your son cope with new people? Should I get the instructor to come over, or would it be better if you talk to him? I'll send you a photograph what it looks like, what the instructor looks like. Yeah. And that's all the priming stuff to kind of go, let's make this as predictable as possible. So that's definitely something useful in the kind of the sensory side as well. We were touching there the stage desensitization. So I use the analogy of somebody's scared of spiders. You wouldn't just stick them in a bathtub and just cover them in spiders to get them over it.
No.
And that's the same with sensory processing. We wouldn't we'll immerse them in loud sound, they'll get used to it. It may need to be we desensitize over a period of time with those sensory diets, whatever it is, or I think you used an example with the food you were talking about there of let's allow them to just play with it first, touch it first. Don't try and force them to eat it straight away.
So we look at a thing called zones of proximal development. Is that something you've got?
No, I haven't.
Vygotsky.
Yeah.
And the idea is that we all have a comfort zone that we're all comfortable in and happy in and feel safe in and secure in, but we don't grow.
Yeah.
After that, there's a learning zone.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Which is the place where all the learning takes place.
Yeah.
And then finally, we have the panic zone.
Yeah.
And the idea is to move people into the learning zone without moving into the comfort zone. If you have people around a young person, and it can be peers as well as members of staff to manage that, then that can be a calming factor and transfer something that might, if they'd done it on their own, be the panic zone into the learning zone.
Yeah. One of the things, so during, a few things that we can do to help a young person or child during any activity they're finding a bit of a sensory overload or desyncing to. And one is a good one, and I work with a family, we're doing some consultancy work. They're struggling with nail clipping.
Yes.
Cutting nails,
yeah.
Because again, it seems such a normal thing. It's just typical, but there's a number of problems with it, and a lot of you probably come across the quiz. Quite a few.
And to be honest, I can understand it because it is. I think part of me wonders actually if children are more sensitive across their nails than adults are, because I think a lot of children, it is something difficult.
Definitely.
Not just children within the autistic spectrum. Generally.
So there's a few things we could do if we take that as an example, and there's a few building blocks and things that can be used for other stuff. So one is don't make it all about the nail cutting. Distraction. So if they find something hard, then what do they enjoy doing, and can you combine the two together? So if they're playing with their iPad at the same time as having their hair cut, you might find that gets on better because they're not solely focused. So it's the old thing of you distract a kid over there while you're giving them an injection.
Yeah.
don't hey, watch this and try to draw attention to it. One of the other things, and I think maybe it's part of why children experience it as difficult, we don't do it very often. So it's kind of like once a month maybe that the nails are trimmed, because especially as the nails don't grow very, very quick. So it's that sudden, and there's no opportunity for habituation to occur. It's that sudden new thing that I don't do very often.
And then it's forgotten and then done again.
Absolutely. So actually, if you've got a child who struggles with that, don't do it once a month. Maybe even do a nail a night and just systematically kind of just do a nail a night on every night. 5 minutes of stuff could maybe help them to kind of cope better. And then that's a shorter time they're doing it for. You're not kind of get them to sit there for half an hour while you're doing the nails.
Yeah.
But the nails one, obviously getting them to have a bath first so the nails are softer also helps. making a positive, so there's actually reward behind it as well. Another thing. It's mentioned in there forward and backward chaining, and we spoke about that separately, didn't we, related to teaching new skills or learning new language or anything along those lines. We can do a similar thing. So within a school setting, for instance, if you've got a child who experiences over-responsivity to noise and things like that, like school assemblies are quite a horrific experience. So you might go, well, let's get them in early before any other children arrive. Let them find a place that's comfortable. Give them a way of getting out of this. That's another part of it, is giving them control. How can they say stop? How can they say, communicate, I'm done with this, or I need out? Like even with you said with the ear defenders, have they got a way of going, I need my ear defenders? And that's part of that learning skill to give them more control over it. So forward kind of chaining would be getting them in the beginning, seeing how they cope and giving them a way out. Backward chaining is, can we start off by just getting them in 5 minutes at the end, see how they can cope, and then 10 minutes at the end. And you mentioned separately about the trousers analogy, kind of same thing, desensitized to that. The other part, and I think this is always important, there will be times when the individual will become overwhelmed. And I should imagine you've come across a few children that are completely, they go into a meltdown and crisis because they cannot eliminate or escape that.
Very much so,
What kind of strategies do you tend to have with
So sometimes the strategy we might use for that is change expectations. So actually it's about, at that point in time, avoid it, get back to a safe place and rethink, replan. Look at your proactive strategies beforehand. Look at the things. Look at your planning. What can we do better? And at the moment, we're taught to use 3 questions. What went well? What didn't go so well? What needs to change? And then what needs to change? What can we do better next time? I think that's signs of safety, I think they call it.
I think that's one of the big rules, isn't it? Flexibility of thinking from the staff is one of the biggest things. So we are trying to encourage a routine and boundaries, but at the same time, you've got to be flexible within those boundaries.
And there's some things that it's more important that everybody's kept safe than actually than someone gets their nails cut on this occasion.
Yeah, absolutely. It may not be the day. And that's quite normal. I think there's a lot of things that we hold expectations around children different to ourselves. That most of us kind of like, if you're feeling a bit poorly, you might go, well, I'm going to be doing this, but you know what? I don't really feel like it today. I don't know if I can cope with it. And we're able to communicate that. We're able to control it. And whereas straight away children who is, especially those with communication difficulties or the cognitive abilities, may not be able to communicate that or understand it in themselves. They just can't. So we have to be flexible for them rather than being flexible themselves. So, as far as to kind of draw us to a close on the session, I think this is a subject we could potentially explore in a lot more detail. It's one of those. The information out there is massive, and I think as you start to go down that rabbit hole, it's very, very complex. And even with some of the children that you've been mentioning, it's kind of they like that, they don't like that, they can cope with this, they can't cope with this. It depends on the day, it depends on the week, and there's so much to it. But thank you very much for your time today and for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you for inviting me along. It's been good fun. It's been good. Very interesting as well.
Thank you very much. And hopefully those at home enjoyed stories from both of us as well. Thank you very much for joining us on this week's podcast, or this month's podcast, for Michael and for myself. We'll call it a good night. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Goodbye.